ever sat in a room full of people and still felt completely alone? I remember a night just like that. It was the end of the year. Laughter echoed, lights sparkled, but deep inside, I felt small, invisible, and empty. It wasn't because no one was around. It was because something inside me was lost, and I didn't know where to begin picking up the pieces. In that moment, a verse came rushing into my mind. A verse so familiar, you've probably heard it 100 times. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I used to think it was just a comforting phrase for sad times. But that night, it wasn't just theory anymore. It was truth. And in this video, I want to invite you on a journey, not to simply hear Psalm 23 again, but to see it with new eyes. To understand why God prepares a table for you in the presence of your enemies, not after the battle is over. To discover the true meaning of peace, not when everything is calm, but when you know you're not walking alone. And most of all, to realize that His hand is closer than you think, even when you no longer feel anything at all. If you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, if you're trying to hold on to faith in a world full of doubt, this video is for you. Stay with me until the end, because I believe a table is being prepared just for you. And maybe today is the day you finally sit down at it. Let's begin. The valley is not the end. Why Psalm 23 still speaks today. There's something timeless about Psalm 23. It's been recited at funerals, whispered in hospital rooms, painted on nursery walls, and memorized by children and soldiers alike. But the truth is, many of us only turn to this passage when we're grieving, when life is heavy, and we're trying to make sense of pain. And yet, Psalm 23 wasn't written in a graveyard. It was written in the wilderness, by a man who knew what it meant to be chased, to be betrayed, to be alone. David, the shepherd turned king, didn't pen these words from a throne. He wrote them in the valley, possibly when he was hiding in caves from King Saul or running from the rebellion of his own son. These words came from a place of darkness, but not despair. That's the first thing we need to remember. The valley is real, but it's not the end. A few years ago, I met a woman named Sarah. She had lost her job, her husband had walked out, and her health was failing. She said, I opened my Bible out of habit, and Psalm 23 was staring at me. I didn't believe a word of it at first, but I kept reading it every morning, every night, and somewhere in that valley, I stopped surviving and started hoping again. Psalm 23 still speaks today because our valleys haven't disappeared. They've just changed names: anxiety, burnout, betrayal, loneliness, disappointment. But the shepherd remains the same. He walks with us, he restores us, he leads us through. The lesson? Don't pitch your tent in the valley. It's not your destination. You're walking through it, not to stay, but to come out stronger on the other side. And that brings us to the next truth in this psalm, one that many overlook. The Lord is my shepherd. But what does it really mean to call him that? Let's look deeper. When you feel lost, the Lord is my shepherd is a declaration. One of the most well-known lines in the Bible begins like this: the Lord is my shepherd. It sounds gentle, almost poetic. But when David wrote those words, he wasn't being poetic. He was being bold. In ancient times, to call someone your shepherd wasn't just a metaphor. It was a declaration of trust, surrender, and identity. You were saying, I'm not in control. I'm not leading myself. I belong to someone who knows the path better than I do. And that's not always easy to say, especially when life feels like a maze. I once sat with a young man named Caleb. He was in his late 20s, smart, capable, but utterly lost. He jumped from job to job, relationship to relationship, always chasing the next thing, never quite feeling settled. One day he said, I believe in God, but I don't really trust him to lead me. I'm scared he'll take me somewhere I don't want to go. It was a moment of raw honesty. But then Caleb asked, what if I tried just for 1 week to stop making every decision on my own and let God lead? That 1 week turned into a month, then a year. Today, Caleb is mentoring young men who are walking through the same kind of confusion he once did. His breakthrough began with a simple shift, from saying God exists to declaring, the Lord is my shepherd. Here's the lesson. You can't follow a shepherd you don't trust, and you can't trust a shepherd you don't know. That's why David doesn't say, "The Lord is a shepherd." He says, "The Lord is my shepherd." Personal, present, protective. So if you feel lost today, if you're stuck between choices, unsure of your future, second-guessing your worth, pause, breathe, and declare it. Even if your heart is trembling, "The Lord is my shepherd. I don't have to figure it all out." Because when you let the shepherd lead, you'll discover something beautiful. He doesn't just take you out of the mess. He takes you to a place of rest. And that leads us into the next line of the psalm, one filled with quiet waters, green pastures. 3. Green pastures and still waters, more than just peace. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. It's such a calming image, isn't it? A peaceful field, a gentle stream, the kind of scene you'd expect to find on a greeting card or a quiet retreat. But what David writes here is far deeper than a moment of serenity. It's about provision, protection, and perspective. Let's unpack that. First, green pastures in ancient Israel weren't lush fields that stretched for miles. They were small patches of grass, hidden in the desert hills, just enough for the sheep to eat for the day. Tomorrow, the shepherd would lead them to the next pasture. God doesn't promise endless abundance all at once. He gives you enough for today. Just like manna in the wilderness, his provision often comes in daily portions, not yearly plans. And those still waters? They weren't decorative ponds. Sheep are terrified of rushing streams. If they fall in, their wool can drag them under. So a good shepherd would find quiet waters, or even carve out a space where the water could pool gently. Still waters are intentional. Peace doesn't just happen. You are led to it. I once met a single mom named Teresa. 2 kids, 3 jobs, barely holding it together. She told me, "I started waking up 20 minutes earlier, not for work, but just to sit with the word and breathe." That tiny window of quiet in the middle of chaos became her still waters. She said it didn't change her circumstances, but it changed her. That's the thing. Green pastures and still waters aren't just places, they're postures. They're how the soul learns to rest, even when the world doesn't slow down. And maybe you're in a season right now where peace feels far away, where rest feels like a luxury you can't afford. But listen to what the verse says again. He makes me lie down. Sometimes God gently forces us to stop because he knows our soul needs rest more than our schedule needs results. Here's the small but powerful truth. If you don't rest by choice, you may be forced to rest by circumstance. And God's rest is never punishment. It's a path to restoration. Which brings us to the next line. The path of righteousness and why it's not always easy. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. At first glance, it sounds beautiful, safe, even noble. But the truth is, righteous paths aren't always easy paths. We often assume that if God is leading, then the road should be smooth. That if we're doing the right thing, we'll feel peace all the time. Doors will fly open, and everyone will support us. But let me tell you about James. James was a successful corporate manager. One day, he felt convicted to report unethical practices happening in his department. He knew it was the right thing. He prayed about it, sought counsel, and then spoke up. The result? He was pushed out quietly 6 weeks later. He told me, "I did the right thing, and it still cost me." But months later, after wrestling with disappointment and uncertainty, he got a job offer in a smaller firm, one where integrity mattered, where his voice was welcomed. And that's where he found not only purpose, but peace. That's what paths of righteousness often look like. Not easy, not glamorous, but right. And here's something you might not know. In Hebrew, the word for paths used here is magalim, which literally refers to circular or well-worn tracks. Sheep naturally follow paths carved into hillsides over time. They're narrow, winding, and sometimes dangerous, but the shepherd knows exactly where they lead. So if you feel like your life is looping, or you're walking a difficult road even though you're trying to obey God, you're not off track. You're just on a righteous path that doesn't always make sense in the moment. And notice this, David says God leads us for his name's sake, not for comfort, not for applause, but because his name is on the line. His character, his promises, his faithfulness. The lesson? Righteousness isn't always rewarded immediately, but it's always remembered eternally. And sometimes it's on these difficult paths that we encounter the deepest presence of God, Because where the road gets darker, that's where the shepherd stays closest. And that leads us to the next verse. Perhaps the most quoted part of this entire psalm. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Let's walk into that valley together and see what God watch our 5. The valley of shadow and the God who walks with you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. This is the line most people remember from Psalm 23, not because it's poetic, but because at some point in life we've all been there. That valley, the one where the light seems to disappear, where joy fades, where answers don't come, and where your prayers feel like they echo back in silence. But notice something. David doesn't say, if I walk through the valley. He says, even though, as if to remind us that valleys are a part of life, not an exception to it. Several years ago, I met a couple who had just lost their teenage son in a car accident. No words could comfort them. No theology could make sense of it. But the mother, through tears, told me this. I used to think Psalm 23 was about avoiding pain, but now I know it's about never being alone in it. That stayed with me. Because the verse doesn't promise we'll skip the valley. It promises something better. You are with me. That's the turning point of the entire psalm. Up until now, David has been talking about God. He leads me, he restores. But in the valley, the language shifts. It becomes personal. You are with me. Isn't that how life works? When everything's good, we talk about God. But when we're in the dark, we start talking to him. There's a quiet power in that. And maybe that's what makes the valley holy. Not because it's comfortable, but because it becomes a place of communion. Because that's where we stop performing, stop pretending, and simply whisper, I need you. Here's the lesson. God never promised to keep us from every dark place, but he did promise we'd never face them alone. He doesn't shout from the mountaintop, you'll be okay. No, he steps into the valley himself, takes our hand, and says, let's walk through this together. And then David adds something powerful. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's what we'll explore next, because God's presence doesn't just soothe our fear, it protects our soul. Let's look at the shepherd's tools and the unexpected comfort they brought in the staff. Why comfort sometimes looks like discipline. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It's a surprising line, isn't it? Because when we think of comfort, we usually imagine a soft blanket, a warm drink, or a reassuring voice. But here David says he's comforted by a rod and a staff, tools used by a shepherd. Let's dig a little deeper. In biblical times, a rod was a short, sturdy club. It wasn't for cuddling sheep. It was for protecting them. When wolves or thieves came near, the shepherd didn't plead, he defended. The rod was a symbol of authority, strength, and fierce love. The staff, on the other hand, was longer, with a gentle curve at the top. It was used to guide the sheep, pulling them back from cliffs, nudging them in the right direction, keeping them close to the flock. It wasn't harsh, but it was firm. Together, these two tools represent something profound about God. He protects us, and he redirects us. Both are acts of love. Both are forms of comfort. I remember a man named Ethan who told me his story. He had wandered far from his faith, chasing success, ignoring the quiet convictions in his heart. Then one day, everything came crashing down. His business failed, his relationship ended, and for the first time in years, he prayed. Not because he was holy, but because he was broken. He said, looking back, I think God let it all fall apart. Not to punish me, but to bring me back. That was his staff pulling me out of danger. And honestly, that was his comfort. Sometimes, what feels like God's correction is actually his compassion in disguise. We don't always recognize it at first. It might look like a closed door, a painful consequence, or even silence. But behind it is a shepherd who refuses to let us destroy ourselves. Here's the truth we often forget. The shepherd disciplines not to control us, but to keep us close. And real comfort isn't always the removal of pain. It's the assurance that you're still being held, even when you don't understand. So the next time life redirects you, pause before calling it a setback. It might just be the shepherd using his staff to lead you somewhere safer. And speaking of safe places, David now shifts from valleys and shadows to something extraordinary, a table prepared for you in the presence of your enemies. Let's explore what that truly means. A table in the presence of my enemies. It's not what you think. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. It's one of the most striking images in Psalm 23. But let's be honest, most of us would rather God remove our enemies than serve us dinner in front of them. Why a table? Why now? And why right there, in the presence of those who wish us harm? To understand this, we have to remember, in ancient culture, a table wasn't just a place to eat. It was a symbol of fellowship, favor, and honor. When a host prepared a table for you, especially in public, they were saying, "This person is under my protection. This person is welcome. This person is mine." So when David says God prepares a table in the presence of his enemies, he's not describing a quiet meal in a safe house. He's describing a bold, public act of honor right in the middle of opposition. It's not just comfort, it's vindication. Not as revenge, but as restoration. Let me tell you about a woman named Carla. Years ago, she was pushed out of a company she helped build. Lies, politics, betrayal, it all happened fast. She was devastated, but instead of fighting back, she stayed silent, trusted God, and moved on. 3 years later, that same company asked her to return, this time as a consultant, not because they were sorry, but because they needed her wisdom. And Carla said, "The sweetest part wasn't the offer. It was knowing I didn't have to seek revenge. God took care of my name while I focused on guarding my heart." That's what this verse means. God doesn't need to remove every enemy to prove his love. He just needs one table, one moment where he lifts your head, pours your cup, and lets the world see, this is my child, and I'm not done writing their story. Here's the lesson. You don't have to chase validation when you're seated at the table of the king. And maybe that table isn't something you earn. Maybe it's something he prepares, simply because you belong to him. But this table is just the beginning, because right after the meal, David writes, "You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." Oil, overflow, and the meaning of true abundance. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. It's such a tender image, oil being poured out, not sparingly, but freely, and not just enough to fill, but to overflow. In ancient times, anointing someone with oil wasn't just a nice gesture. It was a sign of honor, healing, and setting apart. Hosts would anoint guests to show they were welcome, wanted, and safe. Kings were anointed to mark them as chosen. And shepherds, yes, shepherds, would anoint the heads of their sheep with oil to protect them from flies and infections. So when David says, "You anoint my head with oil," he's saying, God sees me, God chooses me, God protects me. This isn't abundance in a material sense. It's not about bigger houses or overflowing bank accounts. It's something richer, soul-level abundance. I once met a retired pastor named Bill. He lived in a tiny home, drove a 15-year-old car, and took care of his sick wife every day. When I asked him if he ever felt like he was missing out, he just smiled and said, "Son, my cup's been overflowing for years. I've got more peace than money, more joy than plans, and more grace than I deserve." That's true abundance. That hit me hard, because most of us, especially in our culture, have been taught that abundance means more. More stuff, more success, more status. But the kingdom of God flips that completely. Overflow in God's economy isn't about accumulation, it's about saturation. It's what happens when you're so filled with his presence, his love, his peace, that it spills into every part of your life and into the lives of others. Here's the lesson. God doesn't want to just fill your cup. He wants it to spill over, so that the people around you can taste his goodness just by being near you. But what happens when the oil stops flowing? When the cup feels empty again? That's where David ends the psalm, not with a question, but with a promise. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Let's talk about what it means to be pursued by goodness, not just occasionally, but every single day. Surely goodness will follow me until when? Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. It's a beautiful promise, but also a bit hard to believe when life feels like it's falling apart. Because let's be honest, there are seasons when it seems like grief is following us, or regret, or disappointment, and we quietly wonder, where's the goodness now? But David doesn't say maybe. He doesn't say, if I behave, or when things are going well. He says, surely, with confidence, with conviction, not because life is easy, but because God is faithful. The word follow in Hebrew here is actually more intense than we realize. It's the word radaf, which means to pursue, to chase down, to hunt. This isn't passive kindness. It's relentless mercy. God's goodness is not behind you like a shadow. It's chasing after you like a shepherd who refuses to let you stray too far. I remember hearing a story about a man named Luis. He had walked away from God in his early 20s, burned by church, hardened by life. But year after year, he kept encountering small reminders, a verse in a song, a stranger's encouragement, a dream that brought him back to childhood prayers. He told me, I thought I was running from God, but really his goodness was running after me the whole time. That's what David meant, that every day, the good ones, the lonely ones, the angry ones, God's mercy is on your trail, even when you're not aware of it, even when you don't feel it. And notice this, David says, all the days of my life, not just the church-going days, not just the peaceful days, all the days, because God doesn't love you in chapters. He loves you through the whole story. Here's the lesson. God's goodness doesn't retire. It doesn't give up. It doesn't run out. If you're still breathing, then mercy is still moving. And where does that mercy lead? That's what David saves for last. Not a mountain, not a victory parade, but something even better. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's finish this journey right where it all began. Living Psalm 23 today. Your table is already set. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's how Psalm 23 ends. Not with fear or striving or uncertainty, but with home, with belonging, with the quiet confidence that we're not just passing through life. We're being led somewhere eternal. But what does that mean for today? For your next Monday morning? For your to-do list, your hard conversations, your private battles? It means this: you're already invited to the table. Right now, before your situation changes, before the healing comes, before the breakthrough arrives, God has already set the table. Not just in eternity, but in your present. He's offering you peace in the chaos, rest in the rush, companionship in the loneliness, direction in the confusion, provision in the uncertainty. A friend of mine, Rachel, told me she used to think she had to earn that table. That once she got her life together, once she stopped doubting or worrying or making mistakes, then she'd feel close to God. But it was during the hardest year of her life, divorce, financial stress, parenting alone, that she said she felt something shift. I stopped trying to impress God, she said, and I started sitting down at the table he'd already prepared for me. You see, the message of Psalm 23 isn't about having a perfect life. It's about having a present shepherd, one who walks with you, fights for you, feeds your soul, restores your hope, and never leaves your side. And the final truth is this: you don't have to chase what God has already placed before you. The table is set, the cup is ready, the shepherd is near. So maybe today is the day you stop running, stop proving, stop striving, and simply sit down, right there, in the presence of your fears, your flaws, your failures. Because grace doesn't wait for perfect. Grace prepares a table for you. Thank you for taking this journey through Psalm 23. If this message touched your heart, would you share it with someone else who might need it too? And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started. There's more to walk through, more to discover, and more of His goodness chasing you down. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, may you live as one who knows the Lord is your shepherd, and He is enough.